Insulin resistance can double your risk of developing depression, even if you've never been depressed a day in your life. Stanford Medicine tracked over 600 people for 9 years. Every single one of them was mentally healthy at the start. The ones who became insulin resistant early in the study were more than 2.5 times as likely to develop major depression by the end of it. The insulin resistance came first, the depression followed, which means for the millions of people already living with type 2 diabetes, the disease isn't just affecting their blood sugar. It is reaching into their brain and changing how they feel, how they think, and whether they have the energy to keep fighting, and almost nobody is telling them that. Think about what happens at a typical diabetes appointment. The doctor checks your numbers, reviews your medication, looks at your feet, your eyes, maybe your kidneys, adjusts a dose, tells you to keep watching what you eat, and you're out the door. The whole visit is about what's happening in your blood. Nobody asks what's happening in your head. Nobody asks if you've been sleeping properly, if you've lost interest in things you used to enjoy, if you've been pulling away from people without really knowing why. A global survey by the International Diabetes Federation found that 3 out of 4 people with diabetes wanted more emotional support from their doctors, but weren't getting any. One doctor who'd been treating diabetes for 30 years said it honestly. In consultations, we're focused on treatment, on reading the labs, on prescribing. Mental well-being is not something most doctors are concerned about, and that blind spot is where people fall apart. Here is what is actually happening inside the body, and I want to explain it simply because it matters more than almost anything else in this video. Your brain runs on glucose. That's its only fuel. And just like every other cell in your body, your brain cells need insulin to let that glucose in. When someone has type 2 diabetes, their cells stop responding to insulin properly. That's what insulin resistance is. But most people think of it as a blood sugar problem, a body problem. They don't realize it's also a brain problem. When insulin resistance reaches the brain, the areas that control motivation, pleasure, and the ability to look forward to something start running on empty. The brain isn't getting the fuel it needs to keep those systems working. New brain cells form more slowly, the connections between existing ones weaken, and what that produces isn't just a bad mood. It produces the kind of heavy, flat, grey exhaustion that makes you stop caring about things you know you should care about. That is depression. And it isn't caused by weakness or a bad attitude. It's caused by a metabolic problem starving the part of your brain that generates drive. But it works the other way around too, and this is where it becomes a trap. Depression doesn't just sit quietly on top of diabetes. It makes the diabetes worse through a process that runs on autopilot. When someone is depressed, their body stays in a state of constant low-level stress. That stress keeps a hormone called cortisol elevated around the clock. Cortisol tells the liver to dump glucose into the bloodstream. It tells your cells to ignore insulin even more than they already are. So a person who is depressed is carrying around a chemical that is raising their blood sugar every single hour, whether they eat perfectly or not. On top of that, depression increases inflammation throughout the body, the same kind of inflammation that speeds up every diabetes complication from nerve damage to heart disease. Depression isn't a separate problem, living next door to diabetes. It's inside the same house, pulling the wires out of the walls. And once those two conditions start feeding each other, something happens that anyone with diabetes will immediately recognize. The exhaustion, not the tiredness you feel after a long day, a different kind. The kind where brushing your teeth feels like a project, where checking your blood sugar feels like climbing a hill, where cooking a proper meal sounds so overwhelming that you eat whatever is closest and then feel guilty about it for the rest of the night. The International Diabetes Federation found that 79% of people with diabetes experience this. They call it diabetes burnout. And it isn't just feeling tired of the routine. It's a genuine state of depletion, emotional, physical, and mental, that comes from managing a condition that never pauses. There's no weekend off from diabetes. Every meal is a calculation. Every reading on the monitor feels like a test you either passed or failed. And 3 out of 4 people who reported burnout admitted they had stopped or interrupted their treatment because they simply couldn't keep going. They didn't quit because they didn't care. They quit because they were empty. And this is the part that needs to be said clearly, because too many people are blaming themselves for something that isn't their fault. When depression takes hold, it removes the exact things that diabetes management requires. The motivation to plan ahead vanishes. The energy to move your body disappears. The ability to stick with a routine falls apart. Research has shown that the more depressed someone is, the less likely they are to take their medication, follow their diet, or stay active. And once those habits slip, the consequences are immediate. Blood sugar climbs, weight shifts, energy drops further. Sleep worsens, and each of those consequences feeds directly back into the depression, reinforcing the feeling that nothing you do makes any difference. That is not a discipline failure. That is what depression does to a person who is already carrying the full weight of a chronic disease. It shuts down the machinery of self-care at the precise moment when self-care matters most. Now add shame to that picture and it gets worse. A lot of people with type 2 diabetes already carry the belief that they cause their own disease. Whether a family member said it out loud or they just absorbed it from the world around them, the message landed, and depression takes that message and turns the volume all the way up. Suddenly it's not just that you're sick, it's that you're failing at being sick. You know what you're supposed to do and you can't do it, and that gap between what you know and what you can manage feels like proof that something is wrong with you as a person. The IDF survey found that 58% of people with diabetes said stigma and shame affected their mental health. So they stop talking about it, they cancel appointments, they pull away from friends, they eat alone. They manage their guilt in private. And the isolation that follows removes the one thing that might have broken the cycle, which is another human being noticing that they're drowning. Nearly half of older adults with type 2 diabetes experience social isolation. That's not a personality trait. That is a consequence of living with a disease that makes people feel like a burden, combined with a mood disorder that makes reaching out feel impossible. And isolation doesn't just feel bad. It makes the body worse. People who are socially disconnected have higher blood sugar, higher blood pressure, and faster disease progression than those who aren't. The loneliness isn't a side effect, it becomes part of the illness itself. The CDC says people with diabetes are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop depression. But the number that should alarm everyone is this one. Only 25 to 50% of those people are ever diagnosed. That means at least half of all diabetics who are clinically depressed right now have never been told they are. They think this is just how diabetes feels. They think the flatness, the withdrawal, the inability to keep up with their own care is a personal failure rather than a medical condition with a name and a treatment. They sit in waiting rooms surrounded by posters about foot care and eye exams and cholesterol targets, and not one of those posters mentions the thing that is most likely to determine whether they follow through on any of it, and it is treatable. That's the part that changes everything. When depression is addressed, whether through therapy, medication, or even just structured support from someone who understands, blood sugar control improves. Medication adherence comes back. The energy to move, to cook, to plan, to show up for appointments starts to return. One study even found that metformin, one of the most common diabetes medications, improved depressive symptoms after 6 months, which tells you just how deeply the two conditions are tangled together. Treat the metabolism and the mood follows. Treat the mood and the metabolism responds. They are not two separate battles, they are one fight with two fronts, and winning on either side helps both. Having both diabetes and depression together roughly doubles the risk of dying compared to having neither. That's not a scare tactic. That is the measured cost of leaving one half of the problem untreated while pouring all the attention into the other half. Every appointment that ends without a single question about mood, sleep, energy, or motivation is an appointment that treated half a patient. The heaviness you feel is not laziness. The days you can't keep up are not proof that you don't care enough. The guilt that follows every skipped medication, every missed walk, every meal you wish you'd handled differently, is not a reflection of your character. It is, in many cases, your diabetes reaching into the part of your brain that produces willpower and dimming the lights. Knowing that won't make it go away overnight. But it changes what you do next. It turns something you are hiding into something you can name. And something you can name is something you can treat. 83% of people in the IDF survey said their greatest source of mental anguish was the fear of developing complications. That fear is valid. But the complication most likely to determine whether you manage everything else is the one that no blood test at your next appointment will measure. It lives in how you feel when you wake up in the morning, in whether the day ahead feels possible or just heavy, in whether you still believe that what you do matters. That question deserves to be asked. And it deserves to be answered honestly, out loud, to someone who can actually help.